She couldn't read the equations on the chalkboard, but she could see the patterns hidden within them, patterns that had eluded one of MIT's most brilliant minds for 7 decades. This is the extraordinary story of Sarah Miller, a dyslexic waitress whose unconventional mind unlocked one of mathematics' most enduring puzzles, forever changing her life and the world of computational geometry. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about human potential. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The breakfast rush at Riverside Diner had its own rhythm, a chaotic symphony of clattering plates, sizzling griddles, and hurried conversations. Sarah Miller navigated it with practiced precision, balancing 3 plates on one arm while refilling, coffee cups with her free hand. At 32, she had mastered the art of the morning shift, anticipating orders before they were placed, remembering complex modifications without writing them down, calculating bills in her head faster than the register could process them. "Order up for table 7, called Marco from the kitchen, sliding a stack of blueberry pancakes under the heat lamp. Sarah nodded, finishing her current table before retrieving the new order. The diner sat on the outskirts of Cambridge, Massachusetts, close enough to MIT that professors and students would occasionally wander in, seeking refuge from campus food or a quiet place to grade papers. That Tuesday morning in October, a silver-haired man occupied the corner booth, papers spread across the laminate surface, a half-empty coffee cup pushed to the side. Professor Thomas Reynolds had been a fixture at MIT for nearly 50 years. His work in computational geometry had earned him international recognition, a wall of awards, and the respect of colleagues worldwide. Yet for the past 7 decades, since he was a doctoral student himself, one problem had remained unsolved, consuming countless nights and filling innumerable notebooks with failed attempts. The Harrington Conjecture, as it had come to be known, involved the optimization of 3-dimensional space, a seemingly straightforward concept that had resisted mathematical proof since its proposal in 1953. Thomas had dedicated his career to finding a solution, watching younger mathematicians attempt and abandon the challenge, each failure adding to the conjecture's mystique. More coffee. Sarah approached his table, pot in hand. Thomas looked up, momentarily disoriented as he returned to the present. "Yes, please." He hastily moved his papers to make room. As Sarah poured, her eyes drifted to the diagrams sketched across his notes, interlocking shapes, arrows, and symbols that formed patterns she couldn't read but somehow understood. She paused, the coffee pot hovering. "Those shapes," she said, "they're not balanced." Thomas glanced at her, then at his papers, a polite dismissal forming on his lips. Waitresses didn't typically comment on advanced mathematical theories. "I'm sorry?" he said, more curious than offended. Sarah set down the coffee pot and pointed to a diagram in the center of his page. "These forms, they're trying to nest together, but they're fighting each other. See how this edge pushes against the flow? It's like trying to stack oranges in a square box." Thomas stared at her, then at the diagram. He had been working on this particular approach for weeks, sensing it was flawed but unable to pinpoint why. And here was this waitress, in a matter of seconds, identifying precisely what had eluded him. "How did you see that?" he asked, caution mixing with genuine interest. Sarah shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "I just see patterns. Always have. Can't read worth a damn, dyslexic, but shapes and systems make sense to me." She tapped her temple. "They fit together in my head." Thomas hesitated, then pushed a blank napkin toward her. "Could you show me what you mean?" Sarah glanced around the diner. The morning rush had subsided, and her manager was busy at the register. She slid into the booth across from Thomas and picked up a pen. "Your shapes are all rigid, fighting to maintain their form," she said, drawing fluid, organic lines on the napkin. "But what if they yielded, adapted?" Her hand moved confidently, creating a series of interlocking forms that seemed to flow into one another. Instead of forcing them to fit a predetermined pattern, let the pattern emerge from their natural tendencies. Thomas watched in silence, witnessing something extraordinary unfold on a coffee-stained napkin. The approach was unorthodox, intuitive rather than formulaic, yet it addressed fundamental aspects of the Harrington Conjecture in ways he had never considered. "This is..." he began, unable to find adequate words. Sarah glanced at the clock and stood up abruptly. "Break's over. Need a refill on that coffee?" Thomas shook his head, still staring at the napkin. "What's your name?" Sarah Miller. "I'm Thomas Reynolds. I teach at MIT. He hesitated. "Sarah, would you mind if I came back tomorrow with a few more diagrams?" She shrugged. "I'm here every morning except Sundays. Coffee's always hot." Thomas carefully folded the napkin and placed it in his breast pocket. As he gathered his papers, his hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the unsettling realization that the answer he had sought for decades might have been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with an entirely different perspective to reveal it. The next morning, Thomas arrived before the breakfast rush, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Sarah greeted him with a fresh cup of coffee and a raised eyebrow. "You brought homework," she observed, nodding at the portfolio. "If you have a moment," Thomas said, "I'd like to show you something." Sarah glanced around the quiet diner, then slid into the booth across from him. 10 minutes, then the regulars start coming in. Thomas opened the portfolio, revealing a series of complex geometric models. These represent various approaches to a problem called the Harrington Conjecture. It involves optimizing three-dimensional space allocation, essentially finding the most efficient way to arrange objects. Sarah nodded, her eyes already tracing the patterns. "Like packing a suitcase perfectly." A crude analogy, but yes, Thomas admitted. "I've been working on this problem for most of my career." Sarah picked up one diagram, tilting her head slightly. "What happens if you rotate the perspective? Not the objects, but how you're looking at them." Thomas blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She couldn't read the equations on the chalkboard, but she could see the patterns hidden within them. Patterns that had eluded one of MIT's most brilliant minds for 7 decades. This is the extraordinary story of Sarah Miller, a dyslexic waitress, whose unconventional mind unlocked one of mathematics' most enduring puzzles, forever changing her life and the world of computational geometry. What happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about human potential. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The breakfast rush at Riverside Diner had its own rhythm, a chaotic symphony of clattering plates, sizzling griddles, and hurried conversations. Sarah Miller navigated it with practiced precision, balancing 3 plates on one arm while refilling coffee cups with her free hand. At 32, she had mastered the art of the morning shift, anticipating orders before they were placed, remembering complex modifications without writing them down, calculating bills in her head faster than the register could process them. "Order up for table 7, called Marco from the kitchen, sliding a stack of blueberry pancakes under the heat lamp. Sarah nodded, finishing her current table before retrieving the new order. The diner sat on the outskirts of Cambridge, Massachusetts, close enough to MIT. that professors and students would occasionally wander in, seeking refuge from campus food or a quiet place to grade papers. That Tuesday morning in October, a silver-haired man occupied the corner booth, papers spread across the laminate surface, a half-empty coffee cup pushed to the side. Professor Thomas Reynolds had been a fixture at MIT for nearly 50 years. His work in computational geometry had earned him international recognition, a wall of awards, and the respect of colleagues worldwide. Yet for the past 7 decades, since he was a doctoral student himself, one problem had remained unsolved, consuming countless nights and filling innumerable notebooks with failed attempts. The Harrington Conjecture, as it had come to be known, involved the optimization of 3-dimensional space, a seemingly straightforward concept that had resisted mathematical proof since its proposal in 1953. Thomas had dedicated his career to finding a solution, watching younger mathematicians attempt and abandon the challenge, each failure adding to the conjecture's mystique. More coffee. Sarah approached his table, pot in hand. Thomas looked up, momentarily disoriented, as he returned to the present. Yes, please. He hastily moved his papers to make room. As Sarah poured, her eyes drifted to the diagrams sketched across his notes, interlocking shapes, arrows, and symbols that formed patterns she couldn't read but somehow understood. She paused, the coffee pot hovering. Those shapes, she said, they're not balanced. Thomas glanced at her, then at his papers, a polite dismissal forming on his lips. Waitresses didn't typically comment on advanced mathematical theories. I'm sorry, he said, more curious than offended. Sarah set down the coffee pot and pointed to a diagram in the center of his page. These forms, they're trying to nest together, but they're fighting each other. See how this edge pushes against the flow. It's like trying to stack oranges in a square box. Thomas stared at her, then at the diagram. He had been working on this particular approach for weeks, sensing it was flawed but unable to pinpoint why. And here was this waitress, in a matter of seconds, identifying precisely what had eluded him. How did you see that? He asked, caution mixing with genuine interest. Sarah shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. I just see patterns. Always have. Can't read worth a damn, dyslexic. But shapes and systems make sense to me. She tapped her temple. They fit together in my head. Thomas hesitated, then pushed a blank napkin toward her. Could you show me what you mean? Sarah glanced around the diner. The morning rush had subsided, and her manager was busy at the register. She slid into the booth across from Thomas and picked up a pen. Your shapes are all rigid, fighting to maintain their form, she said, drawing fluid, organic lines on the napkin. But what if they yielded, adapted? Her hand moved confidently, creating a series of interlocking forms that seemed to flow into one another. Instead of forcing them to fit a predetermined pattern, let the pattern emerge from their natural tendencies. Thomas watched in silence, witnessing something extraordinary unfold on a coffee-stained napkin. The approach was unorthodox, intuitive rather than formulaic, yet it addressed fundamental aspects of the Harrington Conjecture in ways he had never considered. This is, he began, unable to find adequate words. Sarah glanced at the clock and stood up abruptly. Break's over. Need a refill on that coffee? Thomas shook his head, still staring at the napkin. What's your name? Sarah Miller. I'm Thomas Reynolds. I teach at MIT. He hesitated. Sarah, would you mind if I came back tomorrow with a few more diagrams? She shrugged. I'm here every morning except Sundays. Coffee's always hot. Thomas carefully folded the napkin and placed it in his breast pocket. As he gathered his papers, his hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the unsettling realization that the answer he had sought for decades might have been hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with an entirely different perspective to reveal it. The next morning, Thomas arrived before the breakfast rush, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Sarah greeted him with a fresh cup of coffee and a raised eyebrow. "You brought homework," she observed, nodding at the portfolio. "If you have a moment," Thomas said, "I'd like to show you something." Sarah glanced around the quiet diner, then slid into the booth across from him. 10 minutes, then the regulars start coming in. Thomas opened the portfolio, revealing a series of complex geometric models. These represent various approaches to a problem called the Harrington Conjecture. It involves optimizing three-dimensional space allocation, essentially finding the most efficient way to arrange objects. Sarah nodded, her eyes already tracing the patterns, like packing a suitcase perfectly. "A crude analogy, but yes," Thomas admitted. "I've been working on this problem for most of my career." Sarah picked up one diagram, tilting her head slightly. "What happens if you rotate the perspective, not the objects, but how you're looking at them?" Thomas blinked. "I'm not sure I follow." "I don't know," she said, closing the folder. "MIT's a whole different world." "A world that needs different perspectives," Thomas countered gently. "Think about it. Call me when you decide." He wrote his number on the back of his card and handed it to her. Sarah took the card, her mind racing with contradictory thoughts. Part of her wanted to flee back to the familiar comfort of the diner, where expectations were clear and manageable. Another part recognized an opportunity to finally use the aspect of her mind that had always been dismissed as irrelevant. "I'll think about it," she promised. That night, in her small apartment above a convenience store, Sarah sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by the contents of the folder Thomas had given her. The employment contract, the project description, articles about the Harrington Conjecture. Most of the text swam before her eyes, the letters rearranging themselves in the frustrating dance she had battled since childhood. But the diagrams spoke clearly to her. They were like old friends, their patterns and relationships immediately apparent. She traced them with her fingertips, feeling the potential solutions taking shape in her mind. Sarah reached for her phone and opened the voice memo app, her preferred method for recording thoughts and ideas. "The standard approach creates artificial boundaries," she spoke into the recorder, "but if we allow for adaptive configurations based on contact points rather than predetermined grids." She continued speaking her insights, describing shapes and relationships that she saw clearly in her mind, but had never been taught to express in conventional mathematical language. When she finished, she'd recorded over 30 minutes of observations and ideas. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the diner an hour before her shift, finding a quiet booth in the corner. She took a deep breath and dialed Thomas's number. "Professor Reynolds, it's Sarah Miller. I've been thinking about your offer." "And?" Thomas's voice was hopeful. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition. I need help with the reading part. If I'm going to work at MIT, I can't be staring at papers I can't understand." "Of course," Thomas replied without hesitation. "We'll arrange for assistive technology and any accommodations you need. MIT has excellent resources for dyslexic students and staff." "Then I guess I'm your new, what was it? Spatial reasoning specialist." She could hear the smile in Thomas's voice. "Welcome to the team, Sarah. How about I pick you up after your shift today? I can show you the lab and introduce you to Dr. Chen." After hanging up, Sarah sat quietly, watching the early morning light filter through the diner windows. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of possibility unfurling before her, a path that valued the very aspect of her mind that had always been seen as a deficit. She served her last breakfast shift with a lightness in her step, accepting good-natured teasing from Marco about her fancy new job at MIT. As she hung up her apron for the final time, she realized she wouldn't miss the work itself, but she would miss the people, the regulars who knew her by name, the co-workers who had become something like family. "Don't forget us little people," her manager said, handing her a card signed by the entire staff. "Not possible," Sarah replied, surprising herself by getting choked up. "Besides, I'll be back for the blueberry pancakes." Outside, Thomas waited in a modest sedan, looking slightly out of place among the diner's usual clientele. Sarah slid into the passenger seat, her few possessions from her locker tucked into a canvas tote bag. "Ready?" Thomas asked. Sarah nodded, though ready was the last thing she felt. As they drove toward MIT's campus, she gazed out the window at Cambridge's tree-lined streets. Students walked in groups, backpacks slung over shoulders, confidence in their strides. Soon she would be among them, not as a student, but as something else, something she was still struggling to define. The Strata Center, which housed the Department of Mathematics, looked like no building Sarah had ever seen. Its unusual angles and seemingly random design made her smile. It was a building that refused to conform to expectations, much like her own mind. "It's a bit disorienting at first," Thomas admitted as he led her through the entrance. Frank Gehry designed it to challenge conventional spatial perception. "Some people hate it, but I've always found it inspiring." Sarah looked up at the asymmetrical ceiling, the unexpected windows, the staircases that seemed to lead to impossible places. "It makes perfect sense to me," she said. They took an elevator to the 4th floor, where Thomas used his ID card to access a corridor of research labs. At the end of the hall, he opened a door labeled Reynolds Research Group. Inside, a spacious room housed several workstations, holographic displays, and a central conference table. A woman in her 40s looked up from a computer, her straight, black hair cut in a precise bob, glasses perched on her nose. "You must be Sarah," she said, standing to offer her hand. "I'm Eliza Chen. Your napkin drawing has been the highlight of my month." Sarah shook her hand, immediately liking Dr. Chen's direct approach. "Thanks for giving my scribbles a chance." "Scribbles that are challenging fundamental assumptions in computational geometry," Eliza replied. "I've implemented some of your intuitive approaches into our modeling system." She gestured to a large screen where geometric forms shifted and rearranged themselves. The simulation shows a 27% improvement in spatial efficiency over previous models. Sarah watched the simulation, recognition flickering in her eyes. "That's close, but there's still tension along these edges." She pointed to where two shapes met. "If you allow for micro-adjustments based on pressure points, they'll settle more naturally." Eliza glanced at Thomas, eyebrows raised. "Did you brief her on tensile optimization?" "Not a word," Thomas confirmed. Eliza turned back to the computer, making rapid adjustments to the code. The simulation responded, the shapes shifting subtly until they nested together with barely perceptible gaps. "Efficiency rating now at 31% improvement," Eliza announced. "Sarah, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful collaboration." Over the next few weeks, Sarah settled into a rhythm unlike any she had known before. Mornings were spent in the lab, working with Thomas and Eliza to translate her intuitive understanding into formal mathematical models. Afternoons often involved sessions with Dr. Maya Rodriguez, an educational psychologist specializing in dyslexia, who helped Sarah develop strategies for navigating the text-heavy world of academic research. "Your brain isn't broken," Dr. Rodriguez assured her during their first meeting. "It's optimized for different tasks. Our job is to find bridges between your visual spatial strengths and the linear verbal demands of traditional academia. With Maya's help, Sarah began using text-to-speech software, visualization techniques for complex concepts, and recording devices for capturing her insights. For the first time, her dyslexia wasn't an obstacle to be overcome, but simply one aspect of a mind that processed information in unique and valuable ways. The research progressed rapidly. Sarah's intuitive approach to the Harrington Conjecture, combined with Thomas's deep theoretical knowledge and Eliza's computational expertise, began yielding results that attracted attention within the department. Other professors stopped by the lab, curious about the unconventional team and their novel methodology. Not everyone was supportive. Professor Victor Harlow, a longtime rival of Thomas's and a traditionalist in his approach to mathematics, made no secret of his skepticism. Reynolds is parading around a waitress with no formal training as some kind of savant, Sarah overheard him saying to a colleague in the department lounge. It's a publicity stunt, nothing more. The words stung, reinforcing the imposter syndrome that sometimes crept in when Sarah found herself surrounded by people with multiple advanced degrees. But Thomas was quick to counter such attitudes. Harlow's greatest mathematical achievement was proving something that had already been proven in Japanese literature he couldn't read, he told Sarah over coffee. The history of mathematics is filled with outsiders who changed everything precisely because they weren't constrained by conventional thinking. 3 months into the project, the team reached a breakthrough. Using Sarah's approach of adaptive configuration based on intrinsic properties rather than external constraints, they developed a model that addressed the core elements of the Harrington Conjecture. It wasn't a complete proof that would require more rigorous formalization, but it was a pathway that no one had successfully explored in 70 years of attempts. We need to publish a preliminary paper, Eliza said during their weekly meeting. Establish priority on this approach before someone else stumbles onto it. Thomas nodded in agreement. I can draft the theoretical framework, and you can handle the computational modeling section, Eliza. He turned to Sarah. Would you be comfortable being listed as co-author? Sarah looked startled. Me? On an academic paper? You're essential to this research, Thomas insisted. Your contribution needs to be formally recognized. The prospect of seeing her name on a paper she would struggle to read fully was both thrilling and terrifying. What would I need to do? Work with us on the visualizations, Eliza suggested, and help draft the conceptual framework section. We can record your explanations and transcribe them. Sarah thought about Professor Harlow's dismissive comments, about all the teachers who had labeled her as lazy or unintelligent because letters danced across the page when she tried to read them. She thought about the customers at the diner who treated her as invisible, assuming the person refilling their coffee couldn't possibly have valuable thoughts or insights. I'll do it, she said firmly, but I want to present it too when the time comes, not just have my name on it. Thomas and Eliza exchanged glances. Then Eliza broke into a broad smile. I was hoping you'd say that. We'll work on the presentation together. The paper, titled Adaptive Spatial Configuration, a Novel Approach to the Harrington Conjecture, was submitted to the Journal of Computational Geometry in early spring. While waiting for peer review, the team continued refining their model, addressing potential criticisms and strengthening the theoretical underpinnings. Sarah's life had transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. Her small apartment was now covered in diagrams and models. She had traded her waitress uniform for casual clothes that still made her feel slightly out of place among the stylish academics. She had a Massachusetts Institute of Technology ID card that sometimes felt like it must belong to someone else. Yet with each passing week, her confidence grew. She began contributing more actively to lab discussions, no longer waiting for Thomas or Eliza to invite her input. She started using mathematical terminology, though often in unconventional ways that made Thomas chuckle and reach for a pencil to formalize her insights. One rainy afternoon, as Sarah was working alone in the lab, Professor Harlow appeared in the doorway. She tensed, preparing for dismissive comments or pointed questions designed to expose her lack of formal education. Instead, he stood silently for a moment, observing the holographic model she was adjusting. "That configuration," he said finally. "It addresses the boundary condition problem I identified in my 2018 paper." Sarah nodded cautiously. "The boundaries are where traditional approaches break down. They're trying to impose artificial constraints rather than listening to what the system wants to do naturally." Harlow stepped further into the lab, his expression unreadable. "May I?" he gestured, toward the control panel. Sarah stepped aside, watching as he manipulated the parameters, testing the model's response to various inputs. After several minutes, he straightened up. "Reynolds might actually be onto something with you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Your approach is unorthodox, but interesting." Coming from Harlow, it was practically effusive praise. After he left, Sarah sat in quiet amazement. Something had shifted, not just in how others perceived her, but in how she perceived herself. She was no longer just Sarah Miller, dyslexic waitress who saw strange patterns. She was Sarah Miller, researcher, contributor, co-author. That evening, she met Thomas and Eliza at a small cafe near campus. They had news. The paper had been accepted for publication, with reviewers calling it a potentially transformative approach to a long-standing problem in computational geometry. "They've also invited us to present at the International Symposium on Computational Geometry in June," Thomas announced, barely containing his excitement. "It's the perfect venue for introducing this work to the broader community." Sarah felt a flutter of panic. "That's only 2 months away." "More than enough time to prepare," Eliza assured her. "We'll work on the presentation together, find ways to showcase your visual thinking." Thomas raised his coffee cup in a toast to new perspectives and to Sarah Miller, who reminded an old mathematician that some problems require different eyes. Sarah clinked her cup against theirs, a mixture of pride and anxiety swirling inside her. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in her life, she felt as though she was moving in a direction that honored rather than suppressed the unique wiring of her mind. As they walked back toward campus in the gentle spring rain, Thomas mentioned casually, "The department is considering creating a specialized position, a kind of intuitive geometry consultant role. It would involve both research and some work, with students who struggle with traditional mathematical approaches." Sarah glanced at him. "You're offering me a permanent job." "The university is," Thomas corrected. "I merely suggested they'd be fools not to keep you. The paperwork will be formal next week, and I thought you might like some time to get used to the idea." Sarah looked up at the Strata Center looming ahead, its unconventional angles catching the last light of day. 6 months ago, she had been refilling coffee cups, feeling invisible. Now she was being offered a position at one of the world's most prestigious institutions. "I'll need a better apartment," she said finally, "one with enough wall space for all these diagrams." Thomas laughed, relief evident in his expression. "I'm sure that can be arranged." The following Saturday, Sarah visited the Riverside Diner for the first time since leaving. Marco spotted her immediately, calling out from the kitchen, "Look, who decided we're good enough for her now?" Her former co-workers gathered around, asking questions about MIT, teasing her about becoming Professor Miller. Their warmth reassured her that this part of her life wasn't lost, just transformed into something new. As she was leaving, her old manager pressed a small box into her hands, a little something to remind you where you started. Inside was a custom-made name tag, identical to the ones worn by diner staff, but with a difference. Instead of Sarah, Server, it read, Sarah Miller, MIT Spatial Reasoning Specialist. She pinned it to her jacket, wearing it all the way back to campus, a bridge between the person she had been and the person she was becoming. The International Symposium on Computational Geometry was held in a gleaming convention center in Zurich, its modernist glass facade reflecting the surrounding mountains like a geometric puzzle. Inside, hundreds of mathematicians, computer scientists, and engineers gathered from universities and research institutions worldwide. Sarah stood backstage, her heart racing as she peered through the curtain at the growing audience. "I don't belong here," she whispered, turning to Thomas with wide eyes. The professor adjusted his tie calmly. Neither did Einstein when he was working in a patent office. Neither did Ramanujan when he was sending letters from India. Great insights rarely come from expected places. Eliza approached, tablet in hand, reviewing their presentation one final time. "Remember, we've practiced this. You don't need to understand every equation on the slides. That's Thomas's part. Your role is to explain the conceptual framework, the visual reasoning behind the approach." Sarah nodded, smoothing the jacket of her new suit, the first she'd ever owned, purchased specifically for this presentation. In her pocket, she carried the diner name tag her former manager had given her. Its presence was a talisman, grounding her in who she was and where she'd come from. Professor Reynolds, Dr. Chen, and Ms. Miller. A conference assistant approached. "You're on in 5 minutes." Sarah took a deep breath. She had survived her first 6 months at MIT, navigating a world of complex ideas and brilliant minds. She had co-authored a paper that was already generating significant attention in mathematical circles. She could handle 20 minutes on stage. The lights dimmed, and a moderator introduced them. Thomas led the way, followed by Eliza, with Sarah. Bringing up the rear, the audience applauded politely, though Sarah caught curious glances and whispered comments. Her presence, younger than most presenters, lacking advanced degrees, an unknown entity, was already raising questions. Thomas began with the historical context, outlining the Harrington Conjecture and the numerous failed attempts to solve it over 7 decades. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent his life in lecture halls, his voice steady and authoritative. Eliza followed with the computational modeling section, explaining how they had implemented Sarah's insights into algorithmic form. The technical details washed over Sarah, some words still jumbling in her mind, despite months of immersion in mathematical terminology. Then it was her turn. Thomas introduced her with a simplicity that made her both grateful and nervous. And now Sarah Miller will explain the conceptual breakthrough that made our approach possible. Sarah stepped forward, conscious of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. She had prepared extensively for this moment, working with both Thomas and a speaking coach to find ways to articulate her visual thinking. "I see mathematics differently," she began, her voice surprisingly steady. Not as equations or formulas, but as patterns and relationships. When I first looked at Professor Reynolds' diagrams at the diner where I worked, I didn't see the Harrington Conjecture. I saw shapes that were fighting their natural tendencies. She activated the holographic display they had brought, showing the traditional approach to the problem, rigid geometric forms arranged in predetermined configurations. "The standard approach creates artificial boundaries," she continued, gaining confidence as she moved into territory where she felt secure. "It tries to force shapes into positions they resist. But what if, instead of imposing our structure, we allow the shapes to find their own optimal arrangements?" With a gesture, she transformed the display. the forms fluidly reorganizing based on her intuitive model. The audience stirred, mathematicians leaning forward in their seats. Each form has inherent properties, tendencies to move in certain ways, to connect at specific points. When we listen to these properties instead of fighting them, patterns emerge that solve problems we've been struggling with for decades. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah guided the audience through her visualization process, demonstrating how intuitive understanding of spatial relationships could complement formal mathematical approaches. As she spoke, she found herself enjoying the rapt attention, the feeling of finally being able to share how she saw the world. We call this approach adaptive configuration theory, she concluded. It suggests that optimal solutions emerge when we allow forms to seek their natural relationships rather than imposing predetermined structures. The applause that followed surprised her with its enthusiasm. Thomas stepped back to the microphone for concluding remarks, but Sarah hardly heard him. She was watching the audience, noticing how some were already in animated discussion, others taking rapid notes, a few shaking their heads in what might have been disbelief or disagreement. When the formal presentation ended, Sarah expected to slip away, perhaps find a quiet corner to decompress. Instead, she found herself surrounded by conference attendees, their questions coming rapidly. Ms. Miller, could this approach be applied to protein folding problems? Have you considered the implications for architectural design? Did you develop this visualization technique specifically for the Harrington Conjecture, or has it emerged from a broader methodology? Eliza appeared at her side, helping field some of the more technical questions, while Thomas engaged with senior mathematicians who were debating the theoretical implications. The initial 20-minute presentation expanded into an hour-long impromptu discussion group, with Sarah at its center. Among the crowd, Sarah noticed a slender woman in her 60s observing from a slight distance, her silver hair cut in a sharp bob, her expression thoughtful. Unlike others, she didn't push forward with questions, but her attention never wavered. As the group finally began to disperse, the woman approached. "Ms. Miller," she said, her voice carrying a slight German accent. "I'm Dr. Ingrid Hoffmann, chair of the Spatial Cognition Laboratory at ETH Zurich. Would you have time for a coffee tomorrow? I believe there may be applications of your approach that extend beyond pure mathematics." Sarah glanced at Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd like that," she said. Later that evening at the conference reception, Thomas clinked his glass against Sarah's. "You were remarkable today." Sarah sipped her sparkling water, still processing everything that had happened. "I was terrified." "No one could tell," Eliza assured her, joining them with a plate of hors d'oeuvres, "and the response has been extraordinary. The conference organizers said our session had the highest attendance of any presentation thus far." "People were curious," Sarah said with a shrug. "The waitress who stumbled into mathematics makes for an interesting story." "They came for the story," Thomas corrected. "They stayed for the mathematics. Don't underestimate what happened today. Sarah, you've introduced a perspective that many in that room have never considered, a truly intuitive approach to geometric relationships." Sarah was about to respond when she noticed Professor Victor Harlow approaching, accompanied by a younger colleague. She braced herself for criticism. "Reynolds," Harlow greeted, his voice as formal as ever. "An interesting presentation." "Thank you, Victor," Thomas replied evenly. Harlow turned to Sarah. "Ms. Miller, your visualization technique is unorthodox, but I must admit, the efficiency ratings in your models are impressive." Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. "Thank you, Professor Harlow," Sarah said. "My doctoral student, Jensen, has been working on something that might benefit from your perspective," Harlow continued, gesturing to the young man beside him. Perhaps you would be willing to take a look at his models while you're here." Sarah felt a rush of validation that almost made her dizzy. "Of course, tomorrow afternoon." As Harlow and his student moved away, Thomas chuckled. "If you'd told me 6 months ago that Victor Harlow would be seeking your input on a doctoral project, I'd have suggested you check your understanding of probability." The remainder of the conference passed in a blur of presentations, discussions, and networking events. Sarah met with Dr. Hoffman, who proposed a collaborative project on applying adaptive configuration theory to urban planning challenges. She reviewed Jensen's work, offering insights that the frustrated doctoral student received with increasing enthusiasm. By the final day, Sarah had collected a stack of business cards, invitations to collaborate, and requests to speak at other institutions. Her initial fear of not belonging had transformed into a growing recognition that she brought something valuable to this world of abstract thinking. On the flight back to Boston, as Thomas and Eliza napped in their seats, Sarah stared out the window at cloud formations that seemed to arrange themselves in familiar patterns. 6 months earlier, she had been refilling coffee cups, hidden away in plain sight. Now, her mind, the same mind that had struggled with letters and words since childhood, was being recognized as a unique instrument for understanding the world. The return to MIT brought new challenges. The paper's publication and the positive reception at the conference had attracted attention beyond academic circles. The university's public relations department requested an interview, wanting to highlight the unusual path that had led Sarah to contribute to solving the Harrington Conjecture. "You don't have to do it," Thomas told her when she expressed hesitation. "Your work stands on its own merits." But Sarah recognized an opportunity to address something larger than her own story. "I'll do it," she decided, "but I want to talk about dyslexia and alternative cognitive approaches, not just the waitress becomes mathematician angle." The interview, published in MIT Technology Review, presented Sarah's journey with sensitivity and depth. It described her dyslexia not as an obstacle she had overcome, but as a different cognitive framework that had allowed her to see patterns others missed. The article included sidebars on neurodiversity in STEM fields and the potential benefits of incorporating multiple ways of knowing into research methodologies. The response was immediate and widespread. Sarah received emails from parents of dyslexic children, from educators seeking to develop more inclusive approaches, and from researchers interested in collaborating on studies of visual spatial reasoning in mathematics. One message particularly touched her: an invitation to speak at a high school program for students with learning differences. She accepted without hesitation. The program was held in a community center in a working-class neighborhood of Boston, not unlike the area where Sarah had grown up. 20 teenagers sat in folding chairs, their expressions ranging from boredom to curiosity to outright skepticism. Their teacher, a dedicated woman named Ms. Reyes, introduced Sarah with enthusiasm that the students clearly didn't share. "This is Sarah Miller from MIT," Ms. Reyes announced. "She's going to talk to you about how she uses her dyslexic thinking in mathematics." A boy in the back row snorted. "Since when do dyslexic people do math?" Instead of being offended, Sarah smiled. "Since always, actually. We just do it differently." She put aside her prepared remarks and perched on the edge of a table at the front of the room. "How many of you have been told you're bad at math?" Nearly every hand went up. "And how many of you can tell when something is off balance or when a pattern doesn't quite work?" More hands raised with less certainty. "That's mathematics too," Sarah said. "Not the kind they usually teach in school, but the kind that helps you understand how things fit together in the world." For the next hour, Sarah led the students through exercises in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and intuitive problem solving. She brought simple physical models, puzzles and construction sets that demonstrated mathematical principles without requiring traditional calculation skills. By the end, even the skeptical boy from the back row was engaged, successfully completing a spatial challenge that had stumped several of his peers. "This doesn't feel like math," he commented, turning a completed geometric model in his hands. "But it is," Sarah assured him. "It's just math that plays to your strengths instead of highlighting what's difficult for you." As she was leaving, Ms. Reyes caught up with her in the hallway. "That was incredible," the teacher said. "They never engage like that with traditional material. Would you be willing to help us develop more activities like these?" The request triggered an idea that had been forming in Sarah's mind since the conference. "What if it was more than just activities?" she suggested. "What if we created an entire curriculum approach based on adaptive learning techniques that work with different cognitive styles?" Ms. Reyes's eyes widened. "That would be revolutionary, but we'd need resources, institutional support. I might know some people who could help with that," Sarah said, thinking of Thomas, Eliza, and the growing network of researchers who had expressed interest in her approach. Back at MIT, Sarah proposed the idea to Thomas and Eliza during their weekly research meeting. "A comprehensive educational initiative," she explained, "not just for mathematics, but for science education broadly, approaches that work with different cognitive styles rather than against them." Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering. "That's ambitious, but certainly worthwhile. We'd need to build an interdisciplinary team, educators, cognitive scientists, subject specialists, and secure significant funding," Eliza added pragmatically. "Would the university support something like this?" Sarah asked. Thomas and Eliza exchanged glances. "It aligns with several institutional priorities," Thomas said cautiously. "But it would require a formal proposal and probably a pilot study to demonstrate effectiveness." "I could start small," Sarah suggested. "Work with Ms. Reyes's program, document the outcomes, use that as a basis for a larger initiative. And I know several faculty members in the education department who might be interested in collaborating," Eliza offered. The seed of the idea grew rapidly over the following weeks. Sarah divided her time between the ongoing research with Thomas and Eliza, developing materials for Ms. Reyes's students and drafting an initial proposal for what they were now calling the Adaptive Learning Initiative. The work was challenging. In new ways, Sarah found herself navigating university bureaucracy, learning about grant applications, and confronting skepticism from traditionalists who saw her approach as undermining academic rigor. "What you're proposing is lowering standards," one professor argued during a preliminary review meeting. "Education should bring students up to established benchmarks, not redesign the entire system around individual limitations." Sarah had anticipated this criticism. "With respect, Professor, what I'm proposing isn't lowering standards. It's recognizing that there are multiple valid pathways to understanding. The current system privileges one cognitive approach while marginalizing others. That's not rigor, it's arbitrary restriction." The debate continued, but Sarah found unexpected allies. Dr. Maya Rodriguez, the educational psychologist who had helped Sarah develop strategies for navigating academic texts, offered to join the initiative. Several junior faculty members expressed interest in incorporating adaptive techniques into their teaching. Most surprisingly, Professor Harlow voiced qualified support, acknowledging that diverse cognitive approaches might yield innovations in fields that had stagnated. As winter settled over Cambridge, Sarah found herself becoming something she had never imagined, not just a researcher, but an advocate and an educator. The frightened woman who had hesitantly entered MIT's imposing buildings was evolving into someone who moved through academic spaces with growing confidence, who challenged conventional wisdom not from arrogance, but from lived experience. One evening, as snow fell softly outside the lab windows, Thomas found Sarah working late, surrounded by both mathematical models and educational materials. "You've come a long way from the diner," he observed, settling into a chair across from her. Sarah looked up with a smile. "Some days I still feel like I'm going to wake up and find myself taking breakfast orders again." "Do you miss it?" Thomas asked curiously. Sarah considered the question. Parts of it. The simplicity, maybe, knowing exactly what was expected. Here, everything is undefined, constantly changing. "That's the nature of discovery," Thomas said. "If we knew where we were going, it wouldn't be exploration." Sarah nodded, turning her attention to a three-dimensional model on her desk, a teaching tool she had designed for spatial reasoning concepts. "I've been thinking about something, Thomas. The university has been incredibly supportive, but I'm still painfully aware of my lack of formal education. I've been wondering if I should go back to school," Thomas finished for her. "Maybe not in the traditional sense, but there are programs designed for adult learners, approaches that might work with my dyslexia instead of against it." Thomas leaned forward, studying her with the same careful attention he gave to complex mathematical problems. "What would be your goal? A degree for credentialing purposes or specific knowledge you feel you're missing?" "Both, I think," Sarah admitted. "I don't need a degree to do the work I'm doing now. But if I want to expand the adaptive learning initiative, having formal credentials would help with credibility. And there are gaps in my knowledge that become apparent the deeper I get into this field." "Then I think it's an excellent idea," Thomas said, "and MIT has programs that might be well suited to your situation. I'd be happy to help you explore the options." The conversation marked another turning point in Sarah's journey. With Thomas's guidance, she began investigating MIT's flexible education programs, which allowed for customized learning paths and alternative assessment methods. By spring, she had enrolled as a special student, taking 2 courses designed to complement her ongoing research work. The experience of being a student brought fresh challenges. Despite the accommodations available to her, Sarah still struggled with text-heavy assignments and traditional examinations. But she found that the strategies she had developed with Dr. Rodriguez served her well, and her unique perspective often led to insights that impressed her instructors. "You approach problems unlike anyone I've ever taught," her advanced computational modeling professor commented after she had proposed an unorthodox solution to a system optimization challenge. "It's refreshing to see someone willing to abandon conventional frameworks when they aren't serving the goal." As her first term as a student drew to a close, Sarah received news that transformed her professional trajectory yet again. The preliminary proposal for the Adaptive Learning Initiative had caught the attention of the National Science Foundation's Education and Human Resources Division. They were interested in funding a 3-year pilot program with potential for expansion if the results proved promising. "This is extraordinary," Eliza told her when the notification arrived. First-time proposals rarely receive this level of interest, especially for innovative approaches that challenge established methodologies. Sarah sat in stunned silence, reading the email for the 3rd time. The proposed funding amount was substantial, enough to hire a small team, develop comprehensive materials, and implement the program in multiple educational settings. "They want me to serve as the principal investigator," she said, looking up at Thomas and Eliza. "I've never led a project like this." "Nobody has," Thomas pointed out gently. "That's why they're funding it. This approach is uniquely yours, Sarah. No one else could lead it with the same authenticity." The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. From waitress to research assistant to project leader in less than 2 years, it seemed impossible, yet it was happening. The path ahead would require her to build a team, manage a substantial budget, coordinate with educational institutions, and ultimately demonstrate that her intuitive approach to learning could be systematized and shared with others who thought differently. "I'll need help," she acknowledged. "And you'll have it," Eliza assured her. "But this is your vision, Sarah. The rest of us are just here to help bring it into reality." That night, in her new apartment, larger than her previous one, with an entire wall converted into a workspace for her models and diagrams, Sarah called her parents. Their relationship had been complicated since her childhood, marked by their frustration with her academic struggles and her own sense of never quite meeting expectations. "Mom, Dad," she said when they answered, "I have some news." She explained the grant, the project, the opportunity to potentially transform educational approaches for students like herself. There was a long silence when she finished. "We always knew you were smart," her mother said finally, her voice tight with emotion. "We just didn't know how to help you show it." "I'm figuring that out myself," Sarah replied. "But I think that's the point of this whole project, finding ways to recognize and nurture different kinds of intelligence." "We're proud of you, Sarah," her father added, "confused sometimes by what exactly you're doing, but very proud." The conversation continued, bridging years of misunderstanding with new possibilities for connection. When Sarah hung up, she felt a sense of completion, not of her journey, which was still unfolding in unexpected ways, but of a circle that had begun with a child struggling to read, filled with ideas she couldn't express in ways others understood. The following week brought another unexpected development. Professor Thomas Reynolds announced his intention to transition to emeritus status, stepping back from his full teaching load to focus on selected research projects. "You're retiring?" Sarah asked, alarmed when he told her the news. "But the adaptive configuration research is just gaining momentum, and the educational initiative is just starting." Thomas held up a hand, smiling. "Not retiring, transitioning, and not because I'm losing interest, but because I want to focus more fully on the work we're doing together without the distractions of departmental politics and administrative responsibilities." But who will lead the research group?" Sarah pressed. "Dr. Chen has agreed to assume the formal directorship," Thomas explained. "But we're also proposing the creation of a new position, Associate Director for Intuitive Methodologies. The EG department chair is supportive, and the dean has expressed interest, especially given the recent grant and the attention our work has received." Sarah stared at him, processing the implication. "You want me to take that position?" "If you're interested," Thomas confirmed, "it would formalize your role in the research group while allowing you the flexibility to continue your education and lead the adaptive learning initiative." The offer represented a commitment from MIT that went beyond her initial appointment. As a research specialist, it acknowledged her contribution not as a curiosity or a temporary phenomenon, but as a valuable, ongoing presence in the academic community. "I never expected any of this when I poured your coffee that first morning," Sarah said, a slight tremor in her voice. Thomas smiled, the lines around his eyes crinkling. "The most significant breakthroughs rarely announce themselves in advance, Sarah. They emerge quietly, in unexpected moments when someone looks at an old problem with new eyes." As summer arrived, bringing warmth to the MIT campus after the long New England winter, Sarah found herself preparing for yet another first, teaching a course of her own design. Titled Intuitive Approaches to Spatial Problem Solving, the summer intensive was open to both traditional students and participants from community programs, including several from Ms. Reyes's group for students with learning differences. On the first day of class, Sarah arrived early to arrange the room. Instead of the traditional lecture configuration, she had requested tables that could be moved easily, walls covered with whiteboard material for spontaneous visualization, and a variety of physical models and manipulatives. As students began to filter in, undergraduate mathematics majors, visiting scholars, teenagers from local schools, Sarah felt a moment of hesitation. Was she ready to guide others when her own journey was still unfolding? Then she remembered her conversation with Thomas about exploration, about not knowing the destination in advance. "Welcome," she said when everyone had settled. "My name is Sarah Miller. 2 years ago, I was working as a waitress at a diner near campus, struggling to read the orders I was taking because I'm dyslexic. Today, I'm going to teach you how to see mathematics the way I do, not as formulas or equations, but as patterns and relationships that exist in the world around us." A young girl in the front row, 15, maybe 16, with a tablet computer equipped with assistive technology, raised her hand immediately. "If you're dyslexic, how did you become a professor?" Sarah smiled, recognizing in the girl's directness her own younger self. "I'm not actually a professor, not yet anyway. I'm a specialist in spatial reasoning, and I'm still a student myself, in many ways. But I discovered that the way my brain works, which made reading difficult, gave me a different perspective on mathematical problems. And that perspective turned out to be valuable." The girl nodded, seemingly satisfied. "My teacher said I can't do advanced math because I mix up numbers, but I'm really good at geometry." "Then you're already ahead of where I was at your age," Sarah told her. "And by the end of this course, I'm hoping you'll see that what some people call limitations can actually be unique strengths when approached differently." Looking around the diverse group of students, Sarah felt a profound sense of purpose. The path that had brought her here had been neither straight nor easy, but each step, from the diner to the research lab, from the international conference to this classroom, had been necessary in its own way. The Harrington Conjecture had been a starting point, a door opening into a world she never knew existed. But what lay beyond that door was not just mathematical research or academic recognition. It was the opportunity to create space for others whose minds worked differently, whose gifts had been overlooked by traditional systems. As she began the first lesson, guiding students through an exercise in visual pattern recognition, Sarah thought of all the people who had helped her find her voice. Thomas, with his belief in her potential; Eliza, with her pragmatic support; Maya, with her insights into different learning styles; even Professor Harlow, with his grudging acknowledgement of her value. Each had contributed to the transformation from waitress to educator, from someone who silently saw patterns to someone who could help others recognize and develop their own unique ways of understanding. The journey wasn't complete. Perhaps it never would be, but the direction was clear. That evening, as Sarah packed up her materials after class, she found the young dyslexic girl waiting by the door. "Do you think I could ever work at a place like MIT?" the girl asked, a mixture of hope and doubt in her expression. Sarah considered the question seriously. "What's your name?" "Zoe." "Well, Zoe, 2 years ago, I would have said no. That place is like MIT were for people who could read easily and calculate quickly and write elegant equations. Now I know better." She gestured around the classroom. "This space exists because minds like ours have something valuable to contribute. So yes, I absolutely think you could work at a place like MIT, or perhaps somewhere even better that you'll help create." Zoe smiled, clutching her tablet a little tighter. "I'm going to remember you said that." "Good," Sarah replied. "And I'm going to remember that I said it too. Because sometimes we all need reminding that the world has room for many kinds of brilliance." As Zoe left, Sarah turned to the whiteboard where students had mapped their thought processes during the day's exercises. The patterns were diverse, some linear and sequential, others branching and associative, still others circular and recursive. Each represented a different way of approaching the same problems, a different path to understanding. In their variety and their beauty, Sarah saw reflections of the human mind itself, not standardized or uniform, but wonderfully, necessarily diverse. And in that diversity lay possibilities beyond anything she had imagined when she first picked up a pen in a busy diner and began to draw patterns that no one else could see. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when Sarah Miller first glanced at Professor Reynolds' mathematical diagrams in the Riverside Diner. The small classroom where she had taught her first summer intensive had evolved into the Center for Neurodivergent Approaches to Mathematics and Science, a dedicated facility occupying an entire floor in MIT's recently constructed Learning Innovation Building. Today, the center hummed with activity. Undergraduate students worked alongside visiting scholars and young participants from community programs. Holographic displays projected three-dimensional models that could be manipulated through gesture rather than text-based commands. Walls covered in interactive surfaces allowed for spontaneous visualization of complex concepts. In one corner, a group of teenagers were constructing a physical model of a mathematical theorem, their hands busy with components while they discussed approaches in animated voices. Sarah moved through the space, pausing occasionally to offer guidance or ask questions that prompted deeper exploration. Her teaching style had evolved over the years, becoming more confident but never losing the foundation of genuine curiosity that had characterized her approach from the beginning. "Dr. Miller, could you look at this?" A young man with autism spectrum disorder waved her over to his workstation. Jeremy had been with the program since its inception, starting as a hesitant 16-year-old and now serving as a peer mentor while pursuing his own degree in computational physics. Sarah smiled at the doctorate title, still new enough to surprise her occasionally. Her doctoral dissertation on intuitive pattern recognition in advanced geometric problem solving had been completed just 3 months earlier, following a customized educational pathway that played to her strengths while addressing her continuing challenges with traditional text-based learning. "What are you working on, Jeremy?" she asked, studying the complex structure rotating on his screen. "I think I've found a new application for your adaptive configuration theory in quantum field visualization," he explained, his words precise and rapid. "See how the probability fields align naturally when we remove the conventional boundary constraints?" Sarah leaned closer, immediately recognizing the resonance with her original insights into the Harrington Conjecture. "That's fascinating. Have you shown this to Dr. Keller in quantum computing?" Jeremy nodded. "She suggested I develop it further for the symposium next month, but I wanted your input on the visualization approach." Sarah spent the next 15 minutes discussing refinements to Jeremy's model, drawing on both her mathematical intuition and her experience in making complex patterns accessible to diverse cognitive styles. This was what gave her the most satisfaction now, not just her own research, but helping others develop their unique ways of seeing and understanding. As she finished with Jeremy, Sarah noticed Thomas Reynolds standing in the doorway, leaning lightly on a cane. Now in his 70s and officially retired, though he never stopped working entirely, Thomas visited the center regularly, maintaining a keen interest in both the mathematical research and the educational methodologies being developed. "Thomas," she greeted him warmly, "I didn't know you were coming by today. Thought I'd see how the preparations for the international conference are going," he said, his eyes taking in the bustling activity around them. "And I have some news I wanted to share in person." They moved to her office, A bright space with windows overlooking the Cambridge campus, walls covered with dynamic visualizations of mathematical concepts and framed articles about the center's work. On her desk stood a small glass case containing the original napkin drawing from the diner, preserved like a valuable artifact. The National Academy of Sciences made it official this morning, Thomas said once they were seated. You've been elected as a member, Sarah, youngest in the mathematics section in over 30 years. Sarah sat very still, absorbing the news. The National Academy represented the highest recognition in American science, a body that included Nobel laureates and pioneering researchers across disciplines. That's unexpected, she managed finally. Thomas laughed. Only to you. The rest of us have been watching your trajectory for years now. The Harrington solution alone would have eventually earned you consideration. But it's the educational initiative that truly captured their attention. You've changed how we think about mathematical cognition, Sarah. She shook her head slightly, still processing. I never set out to do any of this, you know. That first morning I just saw shapes that weren't fitting together properly. The best scientific revolutions often begin that way, Thomas said. A simple observation that others have missed, leading to questions no one thought to ask. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the open door. Eliza Chen entered, accompanied by a tall woman in a crisp suit, whom Sarah recognized immediately. Dr. Ingrid Hoffman from ETH Zurich, who had approached her after that first conference presentation years earlier. Sorry to interrupt, Eliza. Zedwisit, but Dr. Hoffman's schedule was moved up, and I thought you'd want to discuss the international collaboration right away. Of course, Sarah stood to greet their visitor. Dr. Hoffman, welcome to the center. The Swiss researcher surveyed the office with approval. Impressive what you've built here, Sarah. From our conversation in Zurich, I never imagined it would expand so rapidly. Neither did I, Sarah admitted, but the approach resonated with more people than we expected. The four of them settled around the small conference table in the corner of Sarah's office. What had begun as a modest educational initiative had grown into an international network of research centers, exploring both the mathematical applications of adaptive configuration theory and its implications for neurodivergent education. The Zurich Center is ready to launch next semester, Dr. Hoffman reported. We've secured funding for 5 years, with faculty appointments in place and student applications exceeding our capacity by threefold. Similar situation in Singapore, Eliza added, and the Tokyo program begins pilot classes next month. Sarah listened as they discussed logistics, curriculum alignment, and research coordination across the expanding network. From her initial observation in a diner, a global movement had emerged, one that was transforming both mathematical research and educational approaches for students whose minds processed information differently. There's something else we need to discuss, Thomas said, when there was a pause in the conversation. The Leibniz Foundation has been in touch about their International Prize in Mathematics Education. They're strongly considering the Adaptive Learning Network for this year's award. Dr. Hoffman nodded. I've heard the same from my contacts on the selection committee. It would bring significant additional resources and attention to the work. And pressure, Sarah noted, always practical despite the success surrounding her. We're still refining our approaches, still learning what works best for different cognitive styles. That's precisely why they're interested, Eliza pointed out. It's not a static program being implemented identically across institutions. It's an evolving methodology that adapts to individual learners and cultural contexts. The meeting continued for another hour, discussing developments across the network and planning for the upcoming international conference that would bring researchers and educators from 20 countries to MIT. When Dr. Hoffman and Eliza left to tour the facilities, Thomas remained behind. Something on your mind? Sarah asked, recognizing his thoughtful expression. I was just reflecting on how far we've come, he said. Not just you, though your journey has been remarkable, but our understanding of how the human mind approaches complex problems. For centuries, we've privileged one cognitive style in mathematics, dismissing or marginalizing others. And we've lost countless contributions as a result, Sarah said, thinking of all the students who had found their way to the center after being told they weren't math people or didn't have the right kind of intelligence. Exactly, Thomas agreed. I spent decades trying to solve the Harrington Conjecture using conventional approaches, never considering that the solution might require a fundamentally different way of seeing. Sarah smiled, remembering their early conversations. And I spent years thinking I was simply bad at mathematics because I couldn't process it in the expected way. Their reflection was interrupted by Sarah's assistant appearing at the door. Dr. Miller, your 3 o'clock is here. The interview with Educational Innovations Quarterly. Sarah checked the time, surprised at how quickly the afternoon had passed. Show them in, please. And Thomas, will you join us? They'd love your perspective on how this all began. The interview was one of many that Sarah had grown accustomed to over the years. Journalists, educators, and researchers seeking to understand the phenomenon of the adaptive learning network and the woman whose unusual cognitive style had sparked its creation. The reporter, a thoughtful woman with a background in cognitive science, asked insightful questions about the evolution of the program, its theoretical underpinnings, and its impact on participants. As the conversation progressed, she turned to more personal questions. Dr. Miller, you've become something of an icon for neurodivergent learners, she observed, a success story that challenges conventional narratives about intelligence and ability. How do you feel about that role? Sarah considered the question carefully. Uncomfortable sometimes, she admitted. I never set out to be anyone's inspiration. I was just trying to make sense of patterns I saw, and later to create educational spaces I wish had existed when I was younger. Yet your journey from waitress to leading mathematician and educator resonates powerfully with people, the reporter persisted. Why do you think that is? Because we all need evidence that our differences can be valuable, Sarah said simply. Not in spite of them, but because of them. My dyslexia isn't something I overcame to succeed. It's integral to how I see mathematical relationships. That perspective has turned out to be useful in ways I never imagined. The reporter nodded, jotting notes. And you, Dr. Reynolds, as an established mathematician with a traditional background, what convinced you to champion such an unconventional approach? Thomas smiled. Results, he said. After 7 decades of approaching the Harrington Conjecture through conventional methods, Sarah solved it in minutes by seeing patterns I had missed entirely. Only a profound intellectual rigidity could ignore evidence like that. Or professional insecurity, Sarah added, with a teasing glance at her mentor. Fortunately, Thomas has never suffered from either. Their easy rapport reflected years of collaboration that had evolved from mentor-protégé to colleagues and finally to close friends. Thomas had guided Sarah through the academic world she had never expected to enter, while Sarah had challenged him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about mathematical thinking. After the interview concluded, Sarah walked the reporter out through the main center where afternoon activities were still in full swing. They paused to watch a group of elementary school children engaged in a geometry exercise that involved physical movement and spatial reasoning rather than pencil and paper calculations. They don't realize they're doing advanced mathematics, Sarah explained quietly. They're just exploring patterns that feel natural to them. Later, we'll help them connect those intuitive understandings to formal mathematical language. The reporter observed a young girl who was directing her classmates to form a human demonstration of a geometric principle, her confidence evident, despite a speech impediment that sometimes made her words difficult to understand. "Another Sarah Miller in the making?" the reporter asked. "Better," Sarah replied with a smile. "Another original thinker finding her own path." After the journalist departed, Sarah returned to her office to find an unexpected visitor waiting. Zoe Matthews, the dyslexic teenager who had asked about working at MIT after Sarah's first teaching experience 5 years earlier. "Zoe," Sarah exclaimed with pleasure, "I didn't know you were back from Berkeley." Now 21 and in her 3rd year of a specialized program in computational neuroscience, Zoe had maintained a connection with Sarah and the center, returning during summer breaks to work with younger students. "Just got in yesterday," Zoe said, her confidence a striking contrast to the hesitant girl she had been. "I wanted to show you this before anyone else." She handed Sarah a tablet displaying a research abstract. Sarah read it slowly, still needing to take her time with text. The abstract described a new approach to modeling neural networks based on principles derived from adaptive configuration theory. "You've extended the theory into neural processing," Sarah said, looking up with pride. "This is brilliant, Zoe." "It wouldn't exist without you," Zoe replied simply. "Not just the mathematical foundation, but the belief that my way of thinking could be valuable. That's what you gave me that first summer." "You did the work," Sarah insisted. "All I did was recognize something familiar in how your mind operates." Zoe shook her head, emphatic. "It was more than that. You showed all of us, that our differences aren't deficits. They're just different operating systems for processing the world." The phrase captured something essential about the center's philosophy and about Sarah's own journey from a struggling waitress who couldn't read orders properly to a mathematician reshaping how science understood cognitive diversity. Later that evening, after most of the center's participants and staff had departed, Sarah worked alone in the main space, developing visualizations for an upcoming presentation. The quiet after a busy day always reminded her of those early mornings. In the diner, before the breakfast rush, when she had time to notice patterns in the world around her. Her concentration was interrupted by a notification on her computer, an email from Professor Victor Harlow. Despite his initial skepticism years earlier, Harlow had gradually become a supporter of Sarah's work, particularly after seeing the results among students he had previously dismissed as mathematically inept. The message was brief, typical of Harlow's communication style. "Thought you should see this immediately. Confirms core principles of ACT in quantum applications, revolutionary implications." Attached was a preprint research paper from CERN, where physicists had applied adaptive configuration theory to visualize particle interactions in ways that revealed previously undetected patterns. The paper cited Sarah's work extensively, describing it as a fundamental shift in how we conceptualize and represent complex, multidimensional relationships. As Sarah scanned the paper, she felt a familiar sense of wonder, not at the recognition, but at the expanding ripples from that first simple observation in the diner. What had begun as an intuitive understanding of shapes wanting to find their natural relationships had evolved into a framework being applied across disciplines, from education to quantum physics. She was still reviewing the paper when Thomas returned, having left briefly for dinner. "Good news?" he asked, noting her expression. "See for yourself," she said, sharing the screen. Thomas read more quickly than Sarah could, his eyebrows rising as he progressed through the paper. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "They're finding applications we never anticipated." "That's the beauty of it," Sarah said. "Once you stop forcing patterns into predetermined structures and start listening to what they want to become, possibilities multiply." Thomas settled into a chair beside her workstation. "I've been meaning to ask, have you been back to the diner, the original one where we met?" Sarah nodded. "A few weeks ago, actually. Marco still works the grill, though my old manager retired last year." "And how did it feel, returning as Dr. Sarah Miller of MIT?" She laughed. "Honestly, both strange and completely natural, like visiting a place where an important chapter of your life unfolded, but knowing you've moved beyond it." She paused, reflecting. "They have a framed article about me on the wall. Now, our famous waitress. It's a bit embarrassing, but fitting," Thomas said. "Without that diner, without your path taking you through that specific place at that specific time, none of this might have happened." The observation touched on something Sarah had often contemplated, the seemingly random intersection of circumstances that had allowed her unique way of seeing to find application in the world of advanced mathematics. If she hadn't been working, that morning shift, if Thomas hadn't chosen that diner, if he hadn't spread his papers across the table. "Do you ever wonder about all the other minds out there?" she asked suddenly. "People with perspectives and insights we never discover because the right circumstances don't align." Thomas nodded slowly. "All the time. It's why what you've built here matters so much. It creates deliberate opportunities for those alignments rather than leaving them to chance." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, looking out over the center with its innovative design and technologies, all created to welcome diverse cognitive approaches rather than forcing conformity to a single standard. "Next week is the 5-year anniversary of the center's founding," Thomas noted. "Any special plans for the celebration?" Sarah smiled. "Actually, yes. I've invited everyone who was part of the original summer intensive, the first 16 students who took a chance on this unproven approach. 15 have confirmed they're coming." "And the 16th? "Eduardo Martinez. He's completing fieldwork in Antarctica, but he's sending a holographic presentation about how he's using adaptive configuration theory to map ice flow patterns." Her voice held pride for the shy boy who had bloomed into a confident environmental scientist. "A fitting tribute," Thomas said, "seeing how those initial participants have developed their own applications of these principles." Sarah nodded, thinking of the diverse paths those first students had taken, some into traditional academic fields, others into arts, entrepreneurship, or education. What united them wasn't a particular career direction, but an approach to problem solving that honored their natural cognitive styles. "We should head home," she said eventually, noticing the late hour. "Big day tomorrow with the board presentation." As they gathered their things, Sarah paused at the center's entrance, looking back at the space that had grown from a simple idea into an international movement. On the wall hung a large display showing real-time connections between affiliate centers around the world: Singapore, Zurich, Tokyo, Santiago, Nairobi, and more, each adapting the core methodologies to their own cultural and educational contexts. "Sometimes I still can't believe any of this is real," she admitted. "That a dyslexic waitress who couldn't read the orders she was taking is now Dr. Sarah Miller, elected to the National Academy of Sciences." Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I can," he said simply. "From that first moment when you showed me what I had been missing for 40 years, I knew you were going to change how we understand mathematics. I just didn't anticipate how many other things would change along with it." As they walked through the quiet campus, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. Not a straight path, but a series of unexpected turns. Not a story of overcoming dyslexia, but of recognizing its value. Her mind still processed information differently than most of her colleagues. She still sometimes struggled with text-based materials and traditional academic formats. But rather than hiding these differences, She had built a career and a movement around them. The next. Morning dawned clear and bright, a perfect New England autumn day. Sarah arrived at the center early, as was her habit, enjoying the quiet before students and researchers filled the space with activity. She moved through the rooms, making small adjustments to displays and equipment, mentally rehearsing her presentation. For the board meeting later that day, at precisely 8:30, a young woman appeared at the main entrance, a new participant in the community outreach program recently referred by her high school counselor. Sarah recognized the hesitancy in her posture, the mixture of hope and skepticism in her expression. It was a look she had seen hundreds of times over the years, the face of someone who had been told repeatedly that their mind worked wrong. "You must be Amara," Sarah greeted her warmly. "I'm Sarah Miller. Welcome to the center." The girl nodded nervously. "My counselor said, she said you might be able to help me understand math differently. I've failed algebra twice, but mathematical thinking isn't just algebra," Sarah finished for her. "It's patterns and relationships and spatial reasoning. It's finding order in chaos and allowing complexity to emerge from simplicity." Amara looked skeptical. "That doesn't sound like any math class I've ever had." Sarah smiled. "That's exactly the point. Come on in and let me show you what mathematics looks like when we stop forcing everyone to approach it the same way." Larton, as she led the young woman into the center, introducing her to the innovative learning spaces and the diverse community of thinkers who gathered there daily, Sarah felt the familiar sense of purpose that had guided her since that first insight at the diner. Her journey from waitress to mathematician, from struggling student to educational innovator, had never been about exceptional talent or rare genius. It had been about creating space for different kinds of minds to contribute, about recognizing that human cognition was too diverse and too valuable to be confined to standardized pathways. The Harrington Conjecture had been just the beginning, a searchy door opening into possibilities that continued to expand. What had started with a simple observation about shapes wanting to find their natural relationships had grown into a movement transforming how science understood both mathematics and the human mind itself. And as Sarah watched Amara begin to explore the center's interactive displays, her initial hesitation giving way to curiosity, she recognized the continuation of the cycle. Another mind finding its natural path, another perspective that might one day reveal patterns others had missed entirely. In that moment, standing in the center she had helped create, Dr. Sarah Miller, once a dyslexic waitress who couldn't read orders properly, knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was uniquely designed to do, not in spite of her differences, but because of them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.